What's up, everybody? This is a special edition of Everybody Settle Down. I am Charlie Marlow. That is the great Eric Messersmith. We thought we would just talk about a topic here, Eric, and who better to broach this topic with than you? Because I want to talk about what it's like to live in Los Angeles, California. I'm here in St. Louis. You live in LA, and I want to either debunk or do fact from fiction because I always think the media coverage of especially big cities, it's so outlandish sometimes. We got to ask you what's it actually like. So, hello, how you doing, and what's it like to live in LA?
That's a big topic. There's a lot of positives and a lot of negatives of big city living in general, specifically, and also specifically LA. I'd say it's a net positive though. So let's start with the good. I mean, I think every first of all, I live in Santa Monica, just to be clear. So, but I'm in Los Angeles County, so I'm in
Close
the
enough.
LA metro area. I'm close. The border to LA City is 5 minutes from my house, right? So this is the LA area. It's kind of like St. Louis in that regard, where you know this from St. Louis. You have St. Louis City, and then you have in St. Louis County like 90 municipalities, right?
Hmm.
Some ranging from like very tiny ones to larger ones. That's kind of how LA is on a bigger scale.
Literally,
LA
by the way,
County
literally every stoplight in St. Louis is a new municipality. Every stoplight on
is a new
Manchester Road.
municipality, right? That's kind of how LA is to a with just larger population. A ton, a big city in Los Angeles and a ton of municipalities, Beverly Hills and Santa Monica, and and also neighborhoods that are like cities. But anyway, so in that regard, there's some similarities. I mean, look, the natural beauty in LA in this area is something. I'm an East Coast guy. Born and raised in Pennsylvania, lived in rural Missouri, lived in St. Louis, lived in San Antonio. So I've been around. I had not really spent much time here in LA before I lived here. In fact, I'd only ever been here once in my life before I moved here. The natural beauty is stunning. It really is. Like to have mountains and ocean right there all together. It just, I mean, it's natural beauty. You can't beat it. The weather is not quite perfect, especially this year. It's been really cold, but pretty close, and about as good as you're going to find the continental United States, especially if you're close to the water. It's like basically always 70 degrees. Up until the last few years, it was always sunny. It's rained a lot the last couple of years. So there's a lot. You got Hollywood, you got Silicon Valley, you've got, of course, world class restaurants and two pro sports teams in every league in the LA area, basically. So there's just a lot going on. There's all that stuff. On the downside, of course, you do have crime, you do have homelessness, and I think those are the secondary issues. The main issue is just, and the issue that I think is the driving force for people who leave California in general and LA area specifically is housing costs. I think that is the main negative of living here. Everything else is manageable. Traffic, homelessness, crime. I think a lot of that stuff is overblown, but what is not overblown is the cost of living.
Okay, let's go kind of issue by issue. Now, I was just in Long Beach last week for this allergy institute. And obviously, Long Beach, it's not LA, but it's close. And I did see a decent amount of homeless people. I never felt like I was overwhelmed or I didn't feel unsafe, but there were obviously more homeless people there than there are in St. Louis. Also, this is kind of a tangent, but I was surprised at how industrial Long Beach is. And the beach is not very scenic. There's oil everywhere. Here's maybe debunking fact from fiction. You would think that California is an anti-oil state. And Long Beach, there are oil rigs in every parking lot of every grocery store. I couldn't believe that. I couldn't believe that. Now that's going off on a tangent. So you can comment then on that if you want, but let's start with homelessness also. Just fact from fiction, because on the news, you would think that you walk out of your house and you're going to trip over homeless people. What's it really like?
Yeah, well, on the oil rig thing, real quick, it is interesting because I never would have imagined that, given the reputation of California, but also the reality in that California gets a huge percentage of its energy now from renewables.
Mhm.
When there are wind turbines, especially if you go out toward Palm Springs area, a couple hours from here, there are hundreds of wind turbines out there. It's an incredibly windy area. and solar panels, of course, everywhere on houses now, and those are being brought in more and more. So California gets a very, I forget what the exact numbers. I think it's like 14 or 15% of its statewide energy from solar from renewables, and that's going to increase. But that said, it is amazing to see because this is an oil rich area, and we were at a park yesterday, like a beautiful recreation area, and in the distance, like right there, there's oil rigs working, and that's just something you wouldn't think of, with the perception of California as like this very, liberal hippie environmental state, which to some degree it is. Let's be real, but it's they're not 100% against oil. But yeah, in terms of homelessness, it's a real problem. It's a huge problem. It's a growing problem. And it's bad, in the cities. I don't know that it's as bad here as it is in, say, San Francisco, Oakland area, but it's pretty bad. Where I live in Santa Monica, you mostly encounter it with people who are wandering through your alleys, going through trash bins at all hours of the day, which is kind of a big thing here. You see some of the people who live in vans that are parked, police will come and move them, then they'll go somewhere else. So it's not just people who don't have a place to stay in terms of not having shelter. That's part of it. But then it's also people who have these camper vans that, sometimes don't even really run or look like they don't run, but they just essentially live on them on the side of the road. That's a huge thing out here too. It's a massive problem. What's this? And but that said, it's mainly confined to certain areas in town. Now, there are a lot of those areas. I want to be clear. It's not just one or two, but it's not like there are homeless people on every sidewalk. You're stepping over them everywhere you go. That is not the reality. That is not accurate. Typically what happens, in at least where I live in West LA, Santa Monica areas, you will see an encampment spring up like under an overpass, let's say, and you'll see it gradually build up. And then eventually there might be dozens of people there, dozens of encampments and tents. Then they'll come and clear them out and they'll all be gone and the trash will be left behind. And then eventually that'll be gone. And then you'll see it somewhere else. That's kind of how it works, at least, in the part of LA I'm in. In the Skid Row area, like in downtown, it's more of a permanent thing, right? That's a little bit different. Uh, Homelessness is tied to, though, look, homelessness is a complicated problem, right? Mental illness is a factor, drug addiction, drug use is a big factor as well. The fact that the weather is very warm here is a big factor because a lot of the homeless people in California aren't native to California. They come here, some, I'm not saying it's a majority, because if you're going to be homeless, wouldn't you rather be homeless here, right? You can pitch a tent on the beach, and people do. So when you go to the beach, you see that. You see homeless people, here or there. Again, it's not everywhere. It's that there's plenty of beachfront that that you can explore that is not covered with homeless, but you will see people here and there. So my point is, there's a lot of factors, but the biggest factor I think is related to what I said earlier: housing. Housing hits everybody here at every level of socioeconomic status and class, ranging from the wealthy all the way down to literally people without homes. The fact that there are so few homes relative to the population, because remember, California, we talk about population loss, there has been, for the first time in its state's history since 2020, since COVID, there has been a slight decline in the total population of California. But when I say slight, I'm talking we went from like 40 million to 39 and a half. I mean, yes, it is a decline, but it is still by far the most populous state in the country. And the housing policies out here have been a disaster for a long time. And that is a huge driver of the homelessness crisis.
Okay, let's move on to crime. We can talk about violent crime, property crime. And this is again, this is where maybe the only time me being uninformed helps, because I do feel like I get a lot of my news from Twitter where you only see the worst of everything. So, this whole idea of retail theft where folks are just going into retail stores, right? And just smashing, grabbing, and just taking everything, whether it's a bunch of handbags, whether it's iPhones. We've all seen these videos. And for whatever reason, right or wrong, California comes to mind, or LA, San Francisco comes to mind. You hear these stories about how now you have to steal a certain amount of money for it to be a felony, right? So they've kind of made it easy to steal. And again, I'm throwing that to you as somebody who That's what I'm hearing, to quote Donald Trump. I'm hearing. So so tell me, what's the truth with all that?
There's a lot of truth to it. Look, I think when you talk about crime, you have to differentiate between violent crime and things like retail theft. And as you and I have talked about on Everybody Settle Down episodes in the past, violent crime had a historic drop in 2023. It surged during COVID 2020, 2021. I'm talking about nationwide here. And it has now in 2023, the murder rate dropped by like 13%, according to preliminary FBI statistics, which is the biggest year over year drop ever. And violent crime rates, even when they spiked in 20 and 2021, 2020 and 2021, are still way below what they were in the 90s in big cities everywhere across the country. That's true in LA. In LA, we actually have, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but relatively speaking, California and LA has a pretty low rate of gun violence and violent crime. That's We have a lot of people, so that's, obviously per capita. Also, we have very strict gun laws, and that would lead you to believe that very strict gun laws do work at lowering gun related crimes, because the gun crime numbers here are pretty low on a per capita basis. But what is not low are the retail theft numbers. That is a real thing. It's, again, I think in the Bay Area, it's worse. I read stories all the time about stores shutting down in the Bay Area, San Francisco, Oakland, because mainly citing retail theft. That I don't read as much about that happening here, but retail theft is a big deal in the LA area, no question about it. I mean, you see it the way you see it, the way I see it is stores that lock things up. I don't know about where you live, but it is crazy how many things are now locked up at grocery stores, at and especially at drugstores. So it used to be you would see it maybe a little bit. Now at some stores, it's like pretty much everything, and especially in the personal care aisle. Not for food, but razors, which apparently people love to steal razor blades, like bath products. Shampoo. You will have to get someone, not everywhere, but at some places, you have to get someone to open a cabinet for you to get shampoo because of the theft. And it is a big deal. And what happens is a lot of it, some of it is just homeless people or people who just need things, and they just go in and take them, right? That is some of it. But a lot of it is organized retail theft rings. And these are professional operations. And what they do is they steal these products, a group of people, they take them to storefronts in certain parts of the city, and then they sell them. They resell them, and these are sometimes abandoned storefronts. And they try to hide their operation, basically, and they get busted sometimes. There was just a big raid not too long ago where this place got busted. That was one of these retail crime rings, and there were thousands of products. Again, a lot of these bath products. These seem to be hot sellers, like deodorant, shampoo, soap, like which makes sense, right? They're non-perishable, so you can steal them, and it's not like you steal a grapefruit, you have a limited time to sell that, but you steal some deodorant, you can sell. And also, of course, it happens at malls a lot with shoes, clothes. You will see people running out of. I haven't seen it personally, but on the news, you will see people running out of malls with clothes and reselling them, and so they bust these rings a lot. And look, policy does play a factor in that. I mentioned earlier that gun policy, you could argue, and I think the data would back you up, restrictive gun policy has over time in California decreased gun rate, the rates of crime with guns. But policy here when it comes to shoplifting, I don't think there's any question it's played a large part in this, because what has happened is the state passed a ballot initiative that made it a misdemeanor if you stole and it was valued at, I think it was under $1,000 or $950. People know that. And then what happened too is you have prosecutors, and we have one here in LA County named George Gascon, who's one of these progressive DAs that, starting around the time of George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter protests, there was a backlash to, the police departments and some criminal justice laws. And so you had a lot of these progressive DAs, and Gascon may be the poster child. He may be the most high profile one in the country that won election and came in, and they wanted to try to reform the criminal justice system through the prosecutor's office by diverting more people to treatment, or rehab trying to be basically softer on crime, especially nonviolent crime. And the message has gotten out. And people, a lot of them are just, they're not afraid of getting arrested because they know, especially for a first offense, that it's going to be essentially a slap on the wrist. And that's why a lot of these liberal DAs, very liberal DAs, are either losing or may lose. Gascon is up for reelection this year. He in California, we have a top two primary system. So everybody runs regardless of party. Then the top two advance to the general. And he advanced to the general, but he's facing a very stiff challenge. I think he's likely to lose. If you follow the primaries this recently in Portland, they had another one of these very liberal DAs. He lost his bid for reelection to a person in his office who was much more moderate in terms of criminal justice reform. So I think what happened is the pendulum swung. Right in the '90s, we had a crime wave in the '80s. People we need passed these very tough on crime laws, including out here in California. The three strikes you're outlaw. We had national legislation, and I think we did swing the pendulum too far. We crack down on to the extent where we were warehousing a lot of people who shouldn't have probably been going to prison. We weren't diverting enough people, back into the workforce, and we had this kind of prison cycle and system. I think what happened is over time we saw the excesses of that and we swung the pendulum in recent years, I think, back a little bit too far the other way, especially in these cities like LA where you have these very liberal district attorneys that look, LA is a liberal area. We know that, right? Portland certainly is a liberal area. But even there, people are like, wait a minute. This just isn't working. And the reason it's not working, again, is not because of violent crime for the most part. It's because of this sense of lawlessness. It's this you go to the store and it's locked up. And yeah, look, is it a little inconvenient to get someone to open a case to get shampoo? Yes, but it's really what it represents. It represents the fact that you have some people, you have a criminal element that is comfortable breaking the law because they know that the ramifications are probably not going to be severe. And so I think you're seeing that change back toward what I hope is getting that pendulum right and being more aggressive with cracking down on some of this stuff because it's definitely gotten out of hand.
Yeah, I think the majority of Democrats would even agree with A, you've taken some of these liberal policies too far, especially in some of these cities. You mentioned things being locked up. And again, when I was in Long Beach, I never felt unsafe. It was a very, I would call it a middle class neighborhood, but California looks different. So I was going to compare it to where I grew up, which is Toledo, Ohio. Now they don't
Yeah.
look the same, but they felt the same. Not rich, not poor, very middle class. But then one of the nights, I just wanted to go get literally a beer. And I go to a mobile gas station to get a tall boy, to get a two by four. And it was locked up. Right? So you couldn't go in. So you had to tell the guy and you had to put your money or credit card in the drawer and he got the beer. And again, it just I never felt unsafe, but when you see that, you feel, okay, they're doing this for a reason, obviously. It's almost like when you're driving through a neighborhood, if you start to see the pawn shops and the gun shops or the check cashing shops, you kind of start to feel like you're not in the greatest neighborhood. And I think that's how I felt when I saw that I can't even get a beer. It wasn't like I was looking around at all afraid, but
Yeah.
I can't even walk in and get a beer because clearly they're doing that for a reason. Somebody's trying to steal stuff.
Right. And the neighborhood thing is a good caveat too to this entire conversation. Because as you know, living in St. Louis, people don't usually just travel to North St. Louis. They don't usually go there unless they live there or have business there. You just kind of know when you live in St. Louis, you probably don't want to drive through North St. Louis because it's a rough area, right? And the same thing here in LA, obviously. Like I don't spend a lot of time, you might be surprised to know, in like South Central. You know what I'm saying? So I can't really speak to what life is like there. Okay. I'm not down there very much. I'm sure it's not great. But, but my point is every city has that, right? And so but I think with California, it gets painted as, especially with San Francisco and LA, it gets painted as, oh, the whole city is like that, or most of the cities like that. And that is just, I mean, that is not the case at all. That if you drove through Hollywood or Beverly Hills or Santa Monica where I live or Brentwood right up the road or Malibu, I mean, you're in like, the wealthiest ritzy area in the country. You would never you're not going to think, oh man, I feel totally unsafe here. That is not the case at all. But I think on crime and homelessness, you are seeing California begin to change. I think there's a realization that has set in with the population, with the governor Gavin Newsom, with the because the state government is entirely controlled by Democrats, with some of the city leaders in this area and especially in the Bay Area, a realization has set in that again, when it comes to retail crime, when it comes to homelessness, the pendulum has swung too far and we need to be more aggressive.
Okay, this is again me being kind of dumb, and we grew up in the '90s. Biggie and Tupac. I'm I'm curious. Is the Bloods and Crips is that still a thing at all, or is there any large influence still in 2024? Because when we were growing up in the '90s, you had Snoop and you had Tupac, and that was a big thing. There were movies about it.
Yeah.
I remember, was it the guy Tukey? Tukey was one of the leaders, and then he went to prison and was reformed, and then didn't he get killed? And people said he shouldn't be killed. So again, that was a thing. I feel like 30 years ago. Is that still a thing?
Well, first of all, it's very funny that two like, lily white guys like you and I from like rural America, middle America are talking about this. So that is just hilarious to start with. But okay, so if you remember, recently this has been in the news because of one of the guys who was allegedly involved in the Tupac shooting just got arrested in Vegas, right? And he was allegedly involved, not the trigger man, but involved, right? So that it brought back stories from that time where that rivalry, East Coast, West Coast, that with the gang related and the hip hop communities, that when Tupac was killed in Vegas, that set off a wave of violence out here in Southern California in the area where he was from and where he went. I mean, Nipsey Hussle is a much more recent name in hip hop that was murdered, LA area rapper. And so there's been others as well so that is still a thing from what I understand. And I know some law enforcement people and they will tell you that gang activity is still, quite strong. I don't know if it's still the Bloods and the Crips. Although I did hear this that, in LA, the school district out here is called LA Unified. Well, not we're in Santa Monica because that's a different district. But if you're in the city, it's LA Unified. So in LA Unified, you're still, from what I understand, not supposed to wear all red because that identifies, you know that, right? Just you're not supposed to wear all red. So yes, I think the answer to your question is as much as white guy living in Santa Monica can tell you that, yeah, the gang activity is still strong.
And you'll laugh at this. Everybody should. I grew up in freaking Toledo, Ohio, and I'm telling you, so we had about 5 elementary schools that went to one junior high called Washington, and then the other 5 went to Jefferson. Look, this wasn't bad neighborhoods, weren't the greatest neighborhoods, but this is back in the mid '90s, whatever. Like, it was a thing in our junior high for some kids. If you went, now I went to Washington, or I went to Washington. If you went to Washington, there were the Bloods at Washington. Now the Crips, they were at Jefferson. And I'm telling you, there was a decent little contingent of 10 to 20 dudes that were wearing the red at Washington and that were wearing the blue at
Oh,
Jefferson.
wow.
Now look, nobody was really ever. Now, did they have some fights? Yeah. Would they have some fights? Whatnot here and there? Yeah. But like, that just goes to show you, like, this is something that I think started in LA, but even freaking kind of suburban kids in Toledo are essentially pretending they're Crips and Bloods 30 years ago
Right.
in junior high.
Yeah. And also it's the Hispanic gangs. That's a real thing too. And that's obviously, if you've read about the fentanyl crisis at all, you know that a lot of that is driven by the drug cartels and their affiliated gangs in the United States that really control that market.
Okay. You mentioned Gavin Newsom. Maybe a president down the road. Maybe the Democrats switch out old Sleepy Joe. Who knows? I'm rooting for that. I don't think you think it's going to happen, but in California, in LA, is he popular? I know he had the recall a couple years back. Is he popular in California even?
Uh, I think he's generally fairly popular. I mean, he won the survived the recall easily, won re-election. I think he's fairly popular still. But look, when you have problems in a big state, and as we've been talking about California does, and you've been the governor for a long time, you're going to get some flack, even if the state overwhelmingly kind of agrees with you on some of the big political issues. And you've seen Gavin Newsom try to move toward the center over the last few years. Some of that I think is because he has his eye on the presidency someday, but some of it is just political reality. Because as I said, even among progressives and moderate voters, there's a pushback to some of these policies, and so I think he's trying to position himself so that he can make that run eventually someday, whether it be this year, small chance, or much larger chance in 2028. But yeah, I think people are getting kind of tired of Newsom. It's kind of my general sense. It's like, yeah, we're not tired enough to like vote against him and pick a Republican by any means, but tired as in, okay, he's been here a long time. Homelessness has gotten worse under his watch. Some of this retail crime stuff has gotten worse. We're facing a big budget deficit out here in California. So yeah, I think he's starting to accumulate some baggage.
Okay. Also, fact from fiction in terms of taxes. You hear the taxes are so crazy in California. Everybody's leaving. Everybody's going to Texas. And then I've heard and read some other things. And Newsom, he was making this case. Remember that great debate against DeSantis with Hannity as the moderator, which was just an insane debate. They should do that every week. It was very entertaining. But he was making the case that look, for very rich people, the taxes aren't great, but for the average folks, it's not bad. What do you think? Is that true? Or what part of it is true at all?
Yeah, I think he's generally right. So remember, taxes are complicated because when people talk about taxes, they're often talking about different things because when you're talking about a state level, there's state income tax, there's property tax, there's sales tax. Various states have different levels of taxes of each of those things. So for instance, Florida can say, well, we have a 0% state income tax. California has a state income tax that gets as high as, I think, for top earners, like 10 or 12%, right? So by that metric, California is much more expensive from a tax perspective than Florida. But of course, that's not the only thing that matters. New In California, we have we have a state income tax, but it is very progressive. Meaning, if you don't make much money, you owe no or little tax, and if you make a lot of money, the tax rates are very high. I think the top rate gets up to 10 or 12%, but I believe that's only if you're a millionaire or more than $1 million. And we also have a progressive tax rate when it comes to capital gains. So if you have big stock sales, then you will pay a much higher rate. So we have a very progressive tax rate in California, which is bad if you're a high earner, but isn't so bad if you're a middle or low income earner, particularly when you consider property tax in California. I don't own a home. Hopefully, I will someday, although maybe not in the state. Property taxes, from what I understand, are fairly low in California because we have capped them at a statewide level. So, relatively low property taxes. Sales tax varies a lot by which municipality you're in. But I think Newsom's general point, which is that the tax burden overall falls disproportionately on the wealthy. And obviously in California, you have a ton of rich people, living here. He's generally right on that. It is a very progressive tax system. In Florida, you are much better off if you're a wealthy person or upper middle class. There's no question about that from a tax perspective. The point Newsom makes, which I think generally is fair, is if you look at the overall tax burden, if for a poorer or lower middle class person, it's close or you're better off in California. I think Newsom's generally right on that. I think the numbers would back that up. And also when you factor in the safety net, like whether you agree or disagree, for your tax dollars, California has an incredibly generous social safety net with Medi-Cal, which is basically like the state Medicaid. Like California does, and some people say that's another driver of the homelessness issue, right? I can tell you, as my child has autism, and I can tell you the programs here are incredibly generous for that. And so that is part of the equation too. It's not just taxes, it's also services.
Yeah, what you get from those taxes. I keep having more questions as I keep thinking about this. I know it's a long time ago, but COVID, another thing with, and we're talking about LA, but also California, a little bit of both. Just, you were there, COVID. What was it like? Where did they take it too far? It seems like we talked about crime earlier. You can make the argument that, look, some of these Democrat policies, they've gone too far. It seemed like LA was also one of the poster children for taking COVID, which to me, hey, you should be safe. You got to live your life, but it was a thing. It wasn't a hoax. It was killing people. But it seemed like LA was always kind of the last to lift a lot of the restrictions. Is that true?
Yes, it is true. We were one of the worst when it came to that, and I think, again, you talk about the pendulum swinging. We did not get that right. I mean, I think there's no question in hindsight, we swung in California too far. I'm talking about the government at the state and local level, because remember, a lot of this was local. So, for instance, where I live in the LA area, schools generally opened in the spring of 2021. So schools were my son was out of school for, I believe, 13 months. So from March of 2020, which was basically when everybody shut down. And then he went back in April of 2021. In the Bay Area, they didn't go back until the following fall. So when it came to schools, we were and it was ridiculous, especially in the Bay Area. But even here, it should have been open earlier. The craziest thing to me was the most egregious thing was early in the pandemic. And I want to be clear, this didn't last nearly as long as a school closure, but there was a period of time where the beaches were closed, where you would go to the beach. And I live about 10 minutes from the beach in Santa Monica, and there would be like caution tape. And, and nobody was on the beach and they were patrolling. I mean, that is absurd. We knew that. We should have known that then. Like, it was pretty clear this virus transmits in mostly indoor settings. That became clear pretty quickly with COVID. And indoor settings were shut down by and large at that point. So people needed to go somewhere. There's a playground right by my house. And for a period of time, and again, I want to be clear, this wasn't for as long as school closures, but there was a period of time where there were cones around the playground equipment. Now, my son and I ignored those and we just stepped right over them and he played. And there was a time where he was the only person there because literally no one else was there. Now, if a cop would have came along, they could have, I guess, cited me and I would have been like, this is fucking crazy. That's what I would have said because it is. And it was even then. So that is true that for a brief period of time, playgrounds and beaches were shut down. And if you wanted to, but again, like I don't, a lot of people, again, getting back to the housing crisis, don't have a big yard in California or any yard at all. My son needed to get out of the house, no school. We were going somewhere. And so we were using that playground and I didn't give a damn about, the cones. So that was ridiculous. And in terms of like restaurant closures, that went on a little bit longer than it should have. Although I think, again, bars and restaurants to me was much more justifiable than certainly outdoor things, but also things like schools. So outdoor because of our climate, we were able to do outdoor dining here basically year round, and places set up their parking lots. So that I actually think went okay. But the school thing was too long, and the beaches and playgrounds ever being closed was just ludicrous.
Yeah, and we don't have beaches here in St. Louis except for Pontoon Beach nearby, but there are playgrounds even here. That wasn't just a LA, California thing. I remember seeing some tape and whatnot on some playground equipment around St. Louis. All right, my final question. It's not even a funny note, but my final debunking. Are all these Hollywood liberal elites, are they just there trying to groom our children? Because that's all that I hear about. And the other day I was actually watching uh Bill Burr on Bill Maher, which was really good. Really good. Two guys I usually agree with a lot. Bill Burr, I think I agree with about everything he says. I do think Bill Maher's he's a little or a lot Hollywood elite. Also, he doesn't have kids, so it's just like my life is so much different than his that we just can't relate to each other. But they were talking about this, and Bill Burr had a great line. He's like, this idea that Hollywood's just full of these freaks trying to go after your children. He's like, it's not more than plumbers. He's like, it's just like and what he was saying was every industry has a percentage of creeps, right? And he's like, I'm just getting tired of this narrative. He's like, That's not what LA
Yeah.
is. That's not what Hollywood is. He's like, there's the same amount of whatever plumbers, teachers, coaches, unfortunately. He's like, LA gets a bad rap for that. That's all people talk about in flyover country.
Yeah, clergy, we can certainly talk
There
about
you
that
go.
as well. Yeah, I don't know, it's hard for me to say. I don't see that. I just don't see a lot of that out here. I mean, look, the trans thing is real, there's no question about that, and some of that, no doubt, is social contagion from social media, but I don't see a lot of indoctrination. Now, I wanna be clear, my son is young and he's special education. But even when like going to his school, I don't see a lot of like biological boys dressed as girls or girls dressed as boys. Now they're young. He's in fifth grade, so or fourth grade, so maybe that will come as he gets older. I just don't see a lot of people trying to push like it just seems, like again, I've lived in Texas, Missouri, Pennsylvania. People generally are people. I just when I go talk to parents or see parents, I don't see some of this crazy, like radical liberal stuff that people envision. Again, I am sure it happens. LA County is a county of the LA metro area, I think, which is LA and Orange County, I think is about 15 million people. So that's a huge number of people. So you're going to see all kinds of, crazy stuff from outliers. But by and large, yes, it's a culturally liberal area. There's no question about that. But I just think again, in my daily life, do I see a lot of people trying to like push agendas overtly on children or otherwise? No, I don't see that. I don't.
And you know what? I don't want to put words in your mouth, but with a lot of this, and this is kind of how I feel. I feel like whether it's LA, whether it's St. Louis, we all have our problems. Sometimes they're big problems, sometimes they're small problems. Most cities have these problems. We need to fix them, we need to correct them, but also the media blows them ridiculously out of proportion. I think that's also fair to say in most cases, generally speaking.
I think it's true. And again, think the biggest one that is actually as bad as people make it out to be is getting back to housing. Like housing is everything. When we talk about homelessness, I mean, think about like West Virginia. West Virginia has much less homelessness than California, much less. Would anyone argue West Virginia is a richer state than California? Of course not. Would anyone argue there's not drug addiction in West Virginia or mental illness? I mean, what like you I think you could argue the drug rates are probably as bad or worse. The poverty is certainly worse in West Virginia, yet they don't have homelessness on the scale. Why is that? Well, I think the biggest factor is housing. Like for a long time, what happened is California, we talk about California being this super liberal place, and in some ways it is. But one way it was not liberal was in housing policy, just like everywhere else. It's, the NIMBYism, not in my backyard. You had these housing groups that basically didn't want any development in their area that wasn't a single family home. And so they fought like hell and were successful for a long time at limiting development, even as the population of California surged. And so there are estimates that we are hundreds of thousands of homes, if not more, behind what we should have for our population. And it's starting to change. Again, I mentioned the moderating of, to some degree, of the legislature and Newsom. They're starting to make changes to that some have already passed, some are being proposed to allow more duplexes and to allow more apartment buildings, to allow more homes to be built, to make it easier to build in general. That is starting to happen, but we're so far behind that it's going to take a decade or more to catch up. And in the meantime, prices are out of control. And that affects you if you're upper middle class trying to buy a home. It's that the median home price in California this year hit over 900,000 median. That's more than twice the national average. It's a million or more here in LA County where I live. And in some areas like Santa Monica here, it's 2 million or more. It's insane for people. And that affects people trying to buy a home or renting. It also, of course, affects people on the margins, people who are poor. A lot of homeless people, homelessness is not a stagnant thing where the same group of homeless people are the same group in 5 years. People move in and out of homelessness all the time. And housing costs is one of, if not the driving reason for that. And it affects everybody up and down the socioeconomic ladder. And it's quite honestly, as I said before, it is, in my opinion, the worst thing about living here. And it's probably the only reason that I would ever move is, and I know a lot like people who have moved that I know, and I've known several since we've been here. They said very little about crime or homelessness or traffic or any of the things you generally think of. Everything was about the cost of living. And that again, when I as going back to it, that is the thing that to me matches the hype you see in the media. That is the thing that actually is as bad as people say it is the cost of living in general, but specifically it's housing. Renting, buying a house is so, especially buying a home, it seems so unattainable to people who do well, people who make way more money than the national average. It's still not enough.
Well said. What's it like to live in LA and California? A special episode of Everybody Settle Down. Eric Messersmith, Charlie Marlowe. Please comment, like, subscribe, share the show, share the channel in your group text, put it on social media. We appreciate it. Eric, we will see you next week, buddy.